The day Beatrice Underwood rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a borrowed mule with nothing but a leather satchel strapped across her chest, and a look in her dark eyes that could strip paint from a barn door, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared. It was the spring of 1878, a year when the cattle drives were still churning through the flat Kansas grasslands, and the town of Caldwell sat perched at the edge of the Cherokee Strip like a man leaning too far over a well. Dusk coated everything. The saloon never closed, and women who arrived alone, without a husband walking beside them, were either running from something or walking toward trouble. Most of the men watching figured Beatrice Underwood was doing both. She was 31 years old, though she carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that made people guess older, and the kind of fire in her expression that made them immediately reconsider. Her hair was dark brown, pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades, and her traveling dress was the dusty gray-green of sage after a dry summer. She had the hands of a woman who had worked land, not just lived beside a man who did, and the set of her jaw said she knew exactly what she was walking into. She dismounted in front of the land office without hesitation, tied the mule to the post with practiced efficiency, and pushed open the door. The land office in Caldwell was run by a man named Gerald Stokes, who was 48 years old, perpetually damp around the collar, and deeply opposed to anything that complicated his afternoon. He looked up from his ledger when the door opened, took one look at the woman standing in it, and reached for the dismissive expression he kept handy for situations like this. "Office is busy," he said, though the room was empty except for a fly circling a ham sandwich on his desk. "I can see that," Beatrice said, and set her satchel down on the counter with a thud that rattled his inkwell. "I am here to register a land claim. My name is Beatrice Underwood, formerly Beatrice Calloway, and I have documentation." Gerald Stokes leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach. "Calloway," he repeated slowly, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite recognition, something more like calculation. "You wouldn't be the widow of Thomas Calloway?" "I would be exactly that." The calculation in his eyes sharpened. "Thomas Calloway passed 8 months ago. His land was already assessed and claimed under the Homestead Act. There's nothing left for any widow." Beatrice opened her satchel and placed a folded document on the counter. The paper was worn at the creases, stained faintly at one corner with what might have been coffee, but the writing on it was clear, and the seal at the bottom was unmistakable. Thomas Calloway filed a deed of joint ownership with the Sedgwick County Recorder's Office in 1873, naming his wife, Beatrice Calloway, as co-owner of 320 acres along Bluff Creek. That deed predates any subsequent claim. "I have the original here, and there is a copy filed in Wichita. I want what is mine." Gerald Stokes did not look at the paper. He looked at Beatrice. Then he picked up the document with 2 fingers as though it might be contagious, squinted at it from a distance that made it impossible to read anything, and set it back down. "I'll need to review this properly. Come back Thursday." "Today is Monday." "Thursday," he said firmly, and opened his ledger again. Beatrice looked at him for a long, steady moment. She picked up the document, folded it carefully, and placed it back in her satchel. "Thursday," she said, and walked out. She stood on the plank sidewalk for a moment, letting the afternoon sun hit her face, and she breathed slowly through her nose the way she had taught herself to do when anger wanted to do her thinking for her. Then she looked up and down the street, taking stock. There was a dry goods store, a feed barn, a hotel with a sign that promised clean sheets with a confidence the building did not inspire, a barber shop, the saloon, a church with a broken front step, and a small building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Warren Hudson, Surveyor and Land Agent licensed by the state of Kansas." She walked to it. The door was open. The interior smelled of paper and cedar and something faintly smoky, like a man who spent time outdoors. Surveying equipment hung on one wall, brass and polished, catching the light. A long worktable dominated the center of the room, covered in maps and survey charts weighted at the corners by smooth river stones. Behind the table, leaning over a chart with a pencil tucked behind one ear and a coffee cup near his elbow, was a man who looked up when she entered. Warren Hudson was 34 years old, lean but broad-shouldered in the way of men who did physical work, and did not think much about it. With dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar, and eyes the color of the sky about an hour before dark, that particular shade of blue-gray that meant something was coming. He had a straight nose, a jaw that looked like it could take a punch, and the kind of quiet face that did not give much away until you looked at it long enough. He was not wearing a hat, which was unusual for a man in Caldwell, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to the elbows. He looked at Beatrice with straightforward attention, no dismissal, no calculation, just the direct and calm regard of a man who was genuinely interested in whoever had just walked through his door. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Beatrice said. "I have a document I need someone to actually read." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one. He gestured to the chair across the table. "Sit down, please. I have coffee if you want it." "I want it," she said, and sat down. He poured a second cup from the pot on the iron stove in the corner, set it in front of her, and sat down across the table. He said nothing, just waited, which she found immediately remarkable. Most men started talking before a woman had finished her thought. This one waited. She opened her satchel and laid the document on the table. "My name is Beatrice Underwood. My husband, Thomas Calloway, died 8 months ago from a fever that came on fast and didn't leave. Before he died, he told me there was a deed. I found it in a strongbox he had buried under the floorboards of our house in Wichita, which took me 6 weeks to locate because Thomas was a man with secrets and even more confidence in his own memory than was warranted. The deed is filed in Sedgwick County, and there is a confirmed copy there. I have already spoken to the land office here. Gerald Stokes told me to come back Thursday and did not read the document." Warren picked up the paper. He read it. Not a glance, not a skim. He read it, line by line, turning it slightly toward the window for the light, and Beatrice watched his face as he did and tried to read it the way she had learned to read weather. He was quiet for a full minute. Then he set the document down. "This is legitimate," he said. Something unknotted in Beatrice's chest. It was the first time in 8 months that anyone had said that, and the simple fact of it, plain and unqualified, made her throat tighten in a way she refused to show. "I know it is," she said. "This deed was filed in 1873, which predates the homestead filing on that same land by 2 years. He tapped the paper with one finger. "Who filed the subsequent claim?" "A man named Doyle Harker. He has been running cattle on that land since Thomas died. He filed under the Homestead Act claiming the land was unoccupied and unclaimed, which it was not. It had a deed. His filing was fraudulent." "Does Stokes know about Harker's connection to this?" Beatrice looked at him steadily. "Doyle Harker drinks at the same saloon as Gerald Stokes every Friday evening. I was told that by the woman who runs the hotel, who told me everything about this town in approximately 20 minutes and was considerably more useful than the land office." Warren picked up his pencil. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "I have seen this before. It is not uncommon. A man dies. His widow is out of town or not expected to assert herself, and someone moves fast. The land office doesn't ask too many questions because asking questions is inconvenient." He looked up at her. "How long are you prepared to stay in Caldwell?" "As long as it takes," Beatrice said. "I have $32, a trunk at the train station in Wichita, and nowhere particular to be. My husband's family never liked me. My own family is in Ohio, and I would sooner sleep in a field than ask them for anything at this stage of my life. I am 31 years old, and I am tired of watching men make decisions about things that belong to me. So, as long as it takes." He looked at her with that direct, unreadable expression, and then he did smile, and it changed his whole face in a way that was almost startling. It warmed everything. "My name is Warren Hudson," he said. "I am a licensed surveyor and land agent. I know the land law in Kansas better than most judges in this state, and I have had exactly 3 cases in 12 years that I should have won and didn't. I intend to keep that number at 3. You are proposing to help me, Beatrice said. I am proposing to do my job, he said, which is occasionally the same thing. She looked at him for a moment, measuring, then she nodded. What do you need from me? Everything you have. Every piece of paper, every letter, every receipt that connects you to Thomas Calloway and that land. And I need you to tell me everything you know about Doyle Harker. So Beatrice Underwood sat in Warren Hudson's office for 2 hours on a Monday afternoon in April of 1878, and she told him everything. And he listened, writing careful notes on a fresh sheet of paper in a steady, legible hand, asking precise questions at precise moments, and drinking 3 cups of coffee without appearing to notice any of them. She found, to her surprise, that she was not tired by the time she finished. She was, in fact, more awake than she had been in months. Doyle Harker was not a subtle man. He was 51 years old, broad and loud, with the kind of confidence that came from decades of getting what he wanted by simply being the biggest and noisiest presence in any given room. He ran cattle on the land that had belonged to Thomas Calloway, and he had filed his homestead claim 6 weeks after Thomas died, through a lawyer in Wichita who was known for his flexibility in matters of legal technicality. His claim had gone through the county land office without obstacle, because nobody had shown up to object, and because Gerald Stokes had not looked too carefully at the filing date relative to the existing deed. Or perhaps he had looked and decided not to see it. Warren went to the land office the following morning with Beatrice's document and a copy of the county records he had wired to Wichita for overnight, which had arrived by early train. Gerald Stokes was at his desk in exactly the same position as the day before, as though he had not moved in the intervening 24 hours. "Morning, Gerald," Warren said, and laid both documents on the counter. "I need you to look at something." Gerald Stokes looked at Warren with the particular wariness he reserved for people who made his life complicated. "Hudson, the Calloway deed, filed 1873. I have the county copy here and the original. The homestead claim filed by Doyle Harker in October of last year is invalid. The land was not unoccupied and unclaimed. It had a prior deed of joint ownership, filed by the original claimant, naming his wife as co-owner. The filing predates Harker's claim by 5 years. Gerald picked up the county copy. He read it. Unlike the day before, he read it properly this time, because Warren was standing there watching him do it and would have noticed anything less. When he set it down, his expression was neutral in a way that was working hard. "There may have been an administrative error," he said. "There may have been," Warren agreed. "Which is why I am here, so we can correct it. I need the Harker claim flagged as disputed pending review, and I need Mrs. Underwood registered as the legitimate claimant for the purposes of the county record. The decision on the full claim can go to a circuit judge, but the flag has to be placed today. That's not standard procedure. Standard procedure, as outlined in the Kansas Land Registration Act of 1875, Section 14, requires the office to flag any claim where a prior deed is presented by a legitimate party. You know this, Gerald. I taught the class you took on it in 1876. There was a long silence. A fly landed on Gerald's sandwich again. He looked at Warren, then at the documents, then at something on the middle distance that was probably the image of Doyle Harker's face and the Friday evening drinks he was now going to have to explain himself through. "I'll flag it," he said. "I appreciate that," Warren said, and meant it without warmth. He came back to his office to find Beatrice already there. She had arrived before him, apparently, and had let herself into the unlocked office, which did not seem to trouble her, and was sitting at his worktable reading one of his survey charts with an expression of focused interest. She looked up when he came in. "You went to see Stokes," she said. "I did. And the claim is flagged. The matter goes to Judge Carol Whitfield, who will be coming through Caldwell in 3 weeks for the quarterly circuit. In the meantime, Doyle Harker cannot make any new permanent improvements to the land, and the flag is a matter of public record." Beatrice was very still for a moment. Then she exhaled slowly, and for just a fraction of a second Warren saw something on her face that she did not usually show: relief so profound it was almost grief, the release of something she had been holding tightly for a very long time. "3 weeks," she said. "3 weeks," he confirmed. "Which means you need somewhere to stay. The hotel. The woman at the hotel is named Margaret Prine, and she has already offered me a room at a reduced rate in exchange for help with the mending." Beatrice looked faintly amused. "I told you she was useful." Warren looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his chest, a kind of recognition, the feeling of encountering something that fit in a way he hadn't expected. He pulled his expression back to professional and poured coffee. "We need to prepare your case," he said. "Judge Whitfield is reasonable, but he will need everything documented, and Harker will have a lawyer." "Of course he will," Beatrice said. "What do you need me to do? Tell me about Thomas Calloway, the man." "Not just the land." She looked at him with a flicker of surprise, but she answered. Thomas Calloway had been a Kansas man, born and bred, the son of a homesteader who had come out from Missouri in the 1850s. He had been a quiet man, not unkind, but private in a way that sometimes felt like distance, and he had loved the land with a depth he could not always extend to the people in his life. He and Beatrice had been married for 7 years. There had been one child, a boy named Samuel, who had lived for 3 days in the winter of 1875 and was buried in the churchyard in Wichita. After that, something had shifted between them, not broken exactly, but changed, like a bone that heals not quite straight. She told this to Warren plainly, without self-pity and without embellishment, the way she told most things, and he listened the same way he had listened the day before, with full attention and without filling the quiet with reassurances that didn't fit. When she finished, he said quietly, "I'm sorry about your son." "Thank you," she said. The simplicity of it again struck her. No elaboration, no uncomfortable pivot, just the acknowledgement, clean and real. She looked at him a moment too long and then looked away at the survey chart. The first week passed in a rhythm of work. Warren and Beatrice spent their mornings in his office, building the documentation for her case. He knew the land law and the procedure. She knew the facts of her situation in the kind of intimate, precise detail that came from living them. They made a thorough combination. She was quick, direct, and had a memory that bordered on alarming. She could recall dates from years past with the same ease that she recalled where she had put her coffee cup. He was methodical, careful, with a gift for translating the specifics of a personal situation into the legal language that a circuit court required. They drank a great deal of coffee. They disagreed, occasionally, about strategy. Beatrice thought they should file a formal fraud complaint against Harker immediately. Warren thought they should wait until the land hearing and present it simultaneously, because a simultaneous filing was harder to dismiss or delay. The disagreement lasted most of one afternoon and ended when Beatrice said, with some exasperation, "Explain to me again why waiting benefits us and not Harker," and Warren walked her through it step by step, and she was quiet for a moment at the end and said, "All right, you're right, I don't like it, but you're right." "You don't have to like it," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I always have to understand it." He found that he liked that about her enormously. In the afternoons, Warren would often be out surveying or meeting with other clients. Caldwell was growing, slowly but steadily, and there was constant need for accurate land measurement as the cattle trade brought money and money brought settlers. Beatrice, for her part, had begun helping Margaret Prine with the hotel in earnest, and had also, within the first week, reorganized the dry goods store's inventory system at the invitation of its owner, a widower named Cal Hutchins, who had been losing stock for 2 years without knowing why, and found the discrepancy in 40 minutes. The town, which had initially watched Beatrice Underwood with the collective expression of a crowd watching a mule try to walk through a church door, gradually began to adjust its position. Margaret Prine was vocally and enthusiastically in her corner from the start, which helped more than a formal announcement would have, because Margaret knew everyone and was afraid of no one. The Reverend, a gentle man named Tobias Marsh, offered her the use of the church for anything she needed and said, simply, that he had read Thomas Calloway's deed when she showed it to him, and it looked perfectly clear to him. "You would be surprised," Warren told her one evening, "how much it matters," the Reverend saying that. They were sitting on the steps of his office in the early evening, which had somehow become a habit in the second week without either of them deciding it was. The sky over the Kansas plain was doing the thing it did at that hour, going from gold to rose to a deep clear blue that had no equivalent anywhere else on earth. The cattle sounds from the southern end of town had quieted. The smell of prairie grass and distant cook fires drifted through the warm air. "Because people trust him," Beatrice said. "Because people trust him," Warren agreed. "And because it takes the decision out of the purely legal sphere. The legal argument is ironclad, but Harker has money, and money can make ironclad look flexible. The Reverend speaking in your favor keeps the moral weight visible." Beatrice looked out at the horizon. She had her hat off, and the evening light caught the line of her jaw and the loose strand of dark hair that had escaped her pin, and Warren looked at her in the way he had been increasingly, carefully not allowing himself to do during business hours. "Do you believe it will go our way?" she asked. "Yes," he said, not hedged, not qualified. "Yes, I do." She looked at him. "Why are you helping me?" "I mean, you have clients, you have your business. This is more than what I could pay for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you came in with a legitimate document and asked someone to read it, and the first man you asked chose not to. That matters to me. The law matters to me. Not as an abstraction, but as a thing that is supposed to actually work for real people." A pause. "And you are very clearly a real person." Something in her expression shifted in the fading light, softened slightly. "That is an unusual thing to say." "It is an unusual way to put a common belief," he said, and the corner of his mouth went up. She looked at him for another moment, then looked back at the horizon, and there was a quality to the silence after that which was different from the silences of their working hours. It was not comfortable exactly. It was more alert, like the air before a storm that nobody is sure whether to hope for or fear. Doyle Harker came to Warren's office on a Thursday morning in the second week, and he did not knock. He was exactly as described, large, loud, and fully convinced of his own authority. He had a man with him, a hired hand named Pete, who stood near the door in the posture of someone who had been brought along to seem threatening. Warren was at his work table when they came in. He looked up and did not change his expression. "Hudson," Harker said, "I hear you've been making trouble on behalf of some widow woman." "I've been doing my job," Warren said pleasantly. "Can I help you with something? You can back off this land business is what you can do. That claim was filed legal and proper, and some woman showing up with an old piece of paper doesn't change that." "The paper was filed in 1873, Warren said. "The claim you're referring to was filed in 1877. If you have a question about how prior claims work under Kansas land law, I'm happy to walk you through it, though I'll have to charge you my standard consultation rate." Harker's face darkened. "You know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," Warren said. "I know what land you run cattle on, I know when that filing was made, and I know what the county records show. I also know that Judge Whitfield is arriving in 11 days and that what is currently in those records is going to be extremely clear to him. That land has been sitting empty. It has not been sitting empty. It has been in dispute, which is a legal distinction. And it has been in dispute because the legitimate claimant was unaware of the filing and has now presented herself with documentation. She has done everything correctly. If you have concerns about the hearing, I would encourage you to discuss them with your lawyer." Warren picked up his pencil. "I have surveying work to finish this morning if there's nothing else." Harker stood there for another moment, breathing through his nose. Then he said, low and flat, "This isn't over." "Not yet," Warren agreed. "The hearing is in 11 days. After they left, Warren sat still for a moment and then walked to the door and looked out into the street. He was not precisely worried, but he was alert. Men like Harker did not usually make direct threats without having considered other options first, which meant the threat had come because the other options had already been explored and found wanting. That was both encouraging and clarifying. He went to find Beatrice. She was at the hotel, sitting with Margaret Prine and a woman named Clara Dover who had just arrived in town to meet her fiancé, and had discovered that the fiancé had, some months prior, quietly married someone else. Margaret was providing Clara with strong tea and strong opinions, and Beatrice was providing practical advice, with a directness that Clara was receiving with something between shock and gratitude. Warren stepped inside and caught Beatrice's eye, and she excused herself and came to the door. He told her about Harker's visit. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Do we need to worry?" "I don't think he'll do anything physical," Warren said. "He has too much to lose with the hearing coming up. But I think we should make sure the documentation is stored in more than one location. I already have copies in my office. I want another set with Reverend Marsh, and I'd like you to send the county copy back to Wichita with a letter to the recorder asking them to confirm receipt. You think he might try to make something disappear? I think he might consider it. I want to make sure the consideration leads nowhere." He paused. "Are you all right?" She looked at him with a slight narrowing of her eyes, not suspicious, more like she was measuring the sincerity of the question. "I am fine," she said. "I have been threatened before in various forms. It has never, to date, had the effect the person intending it was hoping for." He believed her immediately. "Good," he said. "Keep it that way." The corner of her mouth did something that was almost a smile. "Was that concern I heard? It was professional caution," he said. "Of course it was," she said, and the almost smile became a real one, brief and bright, before she turned back to help Clara Dover sort out her life. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. On the 9th day before the hearing, Warren rode out to the Callaway land with Beatrice to survey it formally. It was not strictly required for the case, but having a current professional survey of the land in question, confirming the original boundary descriptions in the 1873 deed, would add another layer of documentation that a judge would find useful. The land was beautiful, in the way that flat land can be beautiful when you are not fighting it, which is a different beauty than mountains or forest, but just as real. It rolled gently toward Bluff Creek, which ran cold and clear along the eastern edge, and the grass was the deep green of early spring, thick and lush from recent rains. There were cottonwood trees along the creek, their new leaves shaking silver in the April wind, and a red-tailed hawk turned slow circles over the south meadow. Beatrice stood at the edge of the land and looked at it with an expression that Warren found he could not read and could not look away from. "Thomas loved this land," she said eventually. "That part was always true. Did you?" Warren asked. She considered it honestly. "I am beginning to," she said, "which I think might be different. He loved it because it was his. I think I might come to love it because I chose it." Warren set up his survey equipment, and they worked through the morning in the easy rhythm they had developed over the past week, her holding the ranging rod while he worked the theodolite, her calling out markers while he recorded measurements, the two of them moving around the land in a pattern that was almost like a dance if you squinted at it the right way. The April sun was warm but not hot, and the air smelled of creek water and new grass and the faint distant smoke of someone's cook fire to the north. They ate their midday meal sitting on the bank of Bluff Creek, the horses tied to a cottonwood behind them, the water running over stones a few feet away. Margaret Prine had packed them something in a tin, cold corn bread and sliced ham and 2 apples, and they ate without ceremony, and with the comfortable silence of people who have already said most of the necessary things and are at ease in the space where the unnecessary things might or might not eventually go. "What made you become a surveyor?" Beatrice asked. "My father," Warren said. "He lost land. Not the way you nearly lost yours, but through ignorance. He didn't understand the deed. He signed something he shouldn't have signed, and a man took advantage of it, and he lost 40 acres that had been in the family since before the war. I was 15. I watched him try to fight it and lose, not because he was wrong, but because he didn't have anyone who understood the law well enough to help him. So I decided to become that person for someone else. Beatrice looked at him. Did you ever get the land back for him? No, Warren said. He died before I was trained enough to try, but I have gotten land back for 8 other families in 12 years. Which I think is what he would have wanted. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "That is a very good reason to do what you do." "I thought so," he said, and looked at the creek, and was aware, with the heightened awareness of a man who has been carefully not acknowledging something for 9 days, that she was sitting close enough that if either of them shifted slightly, they would be touching. He did not shift, but he was aware of it. She was aware of it too, he thought, from the quality of the subsequent silence, which had that charged, careful quality again, the electricity before the storm. "Warren," she said. "Yes. Thank you. Not for the legal work, I mean, for that too, but for the way you have gone about this. You have treated me as a person with a legitimate claim and a legitimate mind, and not everyone has done that. And I know that seems like a low bar." "It is a low bar," he said, with a slight edge in his voice that was not directed at her. "Yes, but you cleared it so easily that it felt like something more." She paused. "I wanted you to know that I see that." He turned his head and looked at her. The afternoon light was full and warm, and her eyes were very dark and very direct. And there was something in her expression that was open in a way he had not seen before, a deliberate openness, a decision. "Beatrice," he said, and his voice was quieter than he intended. "I know," she said. "We have a hearing in 9 days, and I have a land claim that is not yet resolved, and this is a very inconvenient moment." "It is," he agreed. "But I wanted you to know anyway," she said. And then she stood up and began packing away the tin, as efficiently and practically as she did everything, and the moment folded itself up and tucked itself away somewhere that both of them knew it would wait. He finished the survey by mid-afternoon, and they rode back to Caldwell in the golden late light, not talking much but not needing to. 6 days before the hearing, Harker's lawyer arrived in Caldwell. His name was Ernest Combs, from Wichita, and he was the kind of lawyer who wore a suit that cost more than most people in Caldwell made in a month, and carried a briefcase with brass fittings. He took a room at the hotel, which meant he and Beatrice were under the same roof, a fact that Margaret Prine observed with narrowed eyes, and the air of a woman planning something. Combs tried to speak to Beatrice on her first morning there. He intercepted her in the hotel lobby, all professional courtesy and old charm, and suggested that perhaps there was a way to settle the matter that would be satisfactory to all parties, perhaps a financial arrangement that would compensate Mrs. Underwood without the unpleasantness of a public hearing. Beatrice looked at him with the expression of someone who has been offered a glass of water and been told it is champagne. "I want my land," she said. "Not compensation for my land. My land." Combs smiled the smile of a man who is used to wearing people down. "Mrs. Underwood, the legal process can be unpredictable. Then your client should have thought about that before he filed on land that already had a deed," she said, and walked past him. She came to Warren's office within the hour and told him about it. He was not surprised. "It means they're not confident," he said. "If they were confident, they wouldn't be trying to settle." "I know," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew." "Good." He paused. "You're not worried about losing?" "No, about having to sit in a room with Doyle Harker in 6 days and keep my expression neutral." She tilted her head mildly. "You have an excellent neutral expression," he said, without quite meaning to say it as warmly as it came out. She looked at him with a glint of something. "Have you been studying my expressions?" "Occupational habit," he said. "Surveyors read landscapes." The glint intensified briefly. Then she picked up the nearest document and they got back to work, and neither of them mentioned it again. But the air in the office had a different quality for the rest of that morning that both of them noticed and neither acknowledged. 3 days before the hearing, Warren did something he had not done in a long time. He rode out to the Callaway land alone, in the late afternoon, and sat on the bank of Bluff Creek and thought carefully about what he was doing and why. He had taken difficult cases before. He had taken cases where the law was clearly right, and justice had needed someone willing to fight for it. He had always done it because he believed in the work, and he had always been able to keep the personal clearly separate from the professional, because the personal had never been particularly present. Beatrice Underwood was the most present person he had met in 12 years of work. She was in every conversation he had with himself about the case, not as a legal subject but as a person, her directness, her humor, the way she held her grief clean and clear without letting it become a performance, the look on her face when she stood at the edge of this land and said she thought she might come to love it because she chose it. He was a careful man. He did not rush things. But he was honest enough, sitting on the bank of a creek in the fading Kansas light, to admit to himself that what he felt when he sat across the table from her in the mornings was not professional investment. It was something considerably warmer and considerably less manageable, and pretending otherwise was starting to feel dishonest in a way he didn't like. The hearing was in 3 days. After the hearing, assuming it went the way it should go, she would have her land and her business would with him be, technically, concluded. He did not find that prospect acceptable. He rode back to Caldwell in the dark, and the stars over the Kansas plain were enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful, and he made himself no particular promises, but arrived home with a certain amount of clarity that he had not had when he left. The morning of the hearing, Caldwell had the charged, anticipatory atmosphere of a town that knows something interesting is about to happen. Word had spread, as word always does in small places, and the dispute over the Callaway land had become the kind of story that people who had never met either party had opinions about. Gerald Stokes had been notably less cheerful than usual for 2 weeks. Margaret Prine had made sure that her opinions about the matter were known to approximately everyone in the county who passed through her hotel, which was most of them. Judge Carol Whitfield arrived on the morning train, which was precisely on time, which everyone agreed was a good sign for the day. He was a small man in his 60s with white hair and a quality of deliberate patience that sat on him like a coat he had worn for 40 years and was now part of his shape. He set up in the town hall, which was a wooden building that served also as the school 3 days a week and smelled faintly of chalk. Beatrice dressed carefully that morning. She had a dress she had kept for exactly this kind of occasion, dark blue wool, well made and clean, with a high collar and good buttons. She pinned her hair with unusual care. When she came downstairs at the hotel, Margaret Prine looked at her and said, with the frank approval of someone who will tell you the truth whether you want it or not, "You look like a woman who owns something." "I do own something," Beatrice said. "I just need a judge to agree." Warren was waiting at the door of the town hall when she arrived. He had also dressed with care, and he looked at her with an expression that was professional and something else in roughly equal measure, and he said, "Are you ready?" "I've been ready for 8 months," she said. They went in. Doyle Harker was already there with Ernest Combs, who had organized his papers with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times. Harker sat with the heavy stillness of a man trying to look unbothered and not quite succeeding. He glanced at Beatrice when she came in with something that was not quite contempt and not quite assessment, and she met his eyes and then looked away, because he was not worth the sustained attention. Gerald Stokes was present as the land office representative. He looked like a man attending his own trial, which in a way Warren thought he was. Judge Whitfield called the proceedings to order with the efficient directness of a man with a circuit to complete, and the matter of the Callaway land came before the court of the state of Kansas on a clear April morning in 1878. Ernest Combs presented first, as the claimant's representative, and he was good. He was organized and thorough, and he presented the homestead filing with the authority of a man who has absolute confidence in documentation he has carefully arranged. He cited the dates, the terms of the Homestead Act, the compliance of the Harker filing with all procedural requirements. Then Warren rose. He had a gift for this, Beatrice saw in those first moments, a gift she had sensed across the table in his office but not fully understood until she saw it in action. He was not theatrical. He was not aggressive. He was extraordinarily clear. He laid out the 1873 deed with the same quiet precision with which he laid out survey data, fact by fact, date by date, the language of the law spoken plainly, and without embellishment, because it did not need embellishment when the facts were this clear. He presented the original deed, the county copy, his own professional survey confirming the boundary descriptions, the correspondence with the Sedgwick County recorder confirming the filing date, and a letter from the recorder himself stating that the deed had been in the county records without challenge from the date of filing to the present day. Then he said, calmly, "The homestead filing by Mr. Harker states that the land in question was unoccupied and unclaimed at the time of filing. This is incorrect. The land had been under a joint deed of ownership since 1873. A prior claim existed at the time of the Harker filing. The filing was therefore fraudulent, not by error but by misrepresentation of material fact. Mrs. Underwood is the surviving co-owner under the existing deed, and the Harker filing is invalid on its face." He sat down. Judge Whitfield read everything. He read everything with the same attention that Warren always read everything, and the room was very quiet while he did. Then he looked up. "Mr. Combs," he said, "does your client have any documentation that disputes the existence or validity of the 1873 deed?" Combs was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that answers a question before the words do. "We would suggest that the lapse of time and the change in circumstances." "I asked if there is documentation disputing the deed's validity." Another pause. "No, Your Honor." "Then the prior claim is established," Judge Whitfield said. "The Harker homestead filing was made on land that was not, as stated in the filing, unoccupied and unclaimed. It was an active deed of co-ownership. The filing is therefore invalid." He looked at Harker. "Mr. Harker, you have 60 days to remove your cattle and any temporary structures from the Callaway land. Any permanent improvements made during your occupancy will revert to the legal owner." He turned to Beatrice, and his expression was professional but not without kindness. "Mrs. Underwood, the land described in the deed of 1873 is confirmed as your legal property. The county recorder will be notified today." Beatrice sat very still. The room had the breath-held quality of the moment after a door closes, and before you are sure it is locked. Then Margaret Prine, who was sitting in the back row, and who had never in her life been known to restrain herself when something worth celebrating happened, said, "Good," and the tension in the room broke like a wave. Beatrice exhaled. She looked straight ahead for a moment, at something only she could see, and then she turned to Warren, who was sitting beside her, and the look on her face was something he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. It was not triumph. It was bigger than triumph. It was the look of someone who has been told that the thing they knew was true is true, that the world can occasionally be made to align with what is right, and that they were not wrong to fight for it. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. He wanted to say many things. He said, "You did the work." She shook her head once, just barely. "We did the work." Outside the town hall, in the thin April sunshine, a small crowd had gathered because small crowds gather wherever anything is happening in a small town. And when Beatrice walked out with the clean posture of a woman who has just won something important, several people who had been quietly in her corner, including Reverend Marsh, who was beaming, and Cal Hutchins from the dry goods store, came forward to say something. Margaret Prine came out right behind and began telling the nearest 3 people the details of the ruling in the comprehensive way of a woman who will be telling this story for 30 years. Warren stood slightly apart, watching, with his hands in his pockets, and a feeling in his chest that he was not immediately going to examine too closely. Doyle Harker walked past him without looking at him, jaw set, Combs at his elbow speaking quietly. It was the exit of a man making calculations, not conceding anything emotionally, and Warren made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation during the 60-day removal period. Men like Harker occasionally became more troublesome in defeat than in opposition. Beatrice found him at the edge of the crowd. The morning sun was full on her face, and her eyes were bright with something that was not tears but was in the same neighborhood. "I need to go to the land," she said. "Today, I need to stand on it now that it's mine." "I'll ride out with you," he said without any deliberation. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "All right." They rode out together in the mid-morning, the town falling away behind them, the grassland opening up on either side in the big, generous way of the Kansas plain, the sky so high and blue it looked like an act of extravagance. The cottonwoods along Bluff Creek were visible from a mile away, the new spring green of them bright against the landscape. Beatrice rode with her hat off, which was not practical but which she was doing anyway, and her hair was coming loose from its pins in the wind, and she looked entirely unlike the careful woman who had walked into the town hall that morning and entirely like herself. She pulled up her horse at the edge of the land and sat still for a moment, looking at it. Then she dismounted and walked to the creek bank and stood with her boots in the edge of the grass and her face in the sun, and she did not say anything for a long while. Warren dismounted and stood a little way behind her, giving her the space of it. After a while she said, without turning around, "I am going to build a house here. A real one, not large but solid, with a kitchen garden on the south side because the light is good there, and I am going to run this land myself." "You'll need help," he said, "at least to start." "I know." She turned around. She looked at him in the full, direct way she had, the way that never let anything hide. "Warren, Beatrice, I told you on the creek bank 9 days ago that I wanted you to know how I felt about what you'd done. That was true, but it was also incomplete." The warm thing in his chest expanded. He did not move. "How so?" "I came to Caldwell with a document and a mission," she said. "I did not come looking for anything else. I was not expecting anything else. I want you to understand that, because I need you to know that what I am about to say is not gratitude, and it is not loneliness, and it is not circumstances making something feel like more than it is." "I understand," he said, and he did. "I think you are remarkable," she said, plainly, without decoration. "I think the way you see the world is remarkable, and the way you work, and the way you listen, and the way you stood in that room this morning and said simple, true things in a way that made them land. I have been trying not to think about you as anything other than my advocate, because thinking about you as something more felt like a complication I couldn't afford." A pause. "The hearing is over." He closed the distance between them in 3 steps that felt like both forever and no time at all, and he took her face in both his hands, careful and deliberate, and she looked up at him with dark, steady eyes and no uncertainty. He kissed her on the bank of Bluff Creek, in the grass that was legally hers, with the cottonwoods shaking silver overhead and the April wind moving across the Kansas plain in long rolling waves. And it was the kind of kiss that neither of them had been entirely prepared for, which was thorough and unhurried and full of the accumulated weight of everything they had not said across the table for 2 weeks. When they finally broke apart, she kept her hands against his chest and he kept his hands in her hair, and they both stood there breathing for a moment. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She laughed, which was a sound he had not heard from her before, full and real and entirely delightful. That was rather decisive. "I am a surveyor," he said. "I measure things carefully and then I act on the measurement." She laughed again, and he thought he could happily spend the rest of his life making her do that. The weeks that followed were a different kind of busy. The land was hers, and she was determined to begin building her life on it with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. Warren continued his surveying work, but found increasingly that his evenings and his weekends, and quite a lot of his waking thoughts, were occupied by a woman with dark eyes and forthright opinions, and a way of holding her coffee cup with both hands in the morning when she was thinking hard about something. They rode out to the land most evenings, when the day's work allowed. She had sketched plans for the house with a detail and practical intelligence that impressed him, and he helped her work through the structural questions, because surveying and building were neighboring disciplines, and he knew enough to be useful. She wrote to a builder in Wichita, a man named Elias Drummond who had been recommended by Reverend Marsh, and he came out to look at the site and confirmed that her plans were sound and gave her a quote that was fair. She contracted him, which required nearly all of her $32 and a loan from the Caldwell bank that the banker, a cautious man named Henry Garrett, extended with only moderate reluctance after Warren vouched for the value of the land and the legitimacy of the deed. Doyle Harker's cattle began moving off the land within the first week after the hearing, which was faster than the 60-day requirement. Warren thought this was because Harker was a strategic man, and making a visible concession early created a different narrative than being forced out at the deadline. He kept his thoughts on this to himself and watched the situation carefully, but Harker, for all his bluster, appeared to have calculated that fighting further was not in his interest and was cutting his losses. On the 31st day after the hearing, Warren came to find Beatrice at the hotel in the late morning, which was unusual, since they normally worked in his office. She looked at him when he came in with that particular reading expression she had. "What is it?" He handed her a letter. "From the Sedgwick County Recorder. The formal registration of the deed in your name is complete. Beatrice Elizabeth Underwood, legal sole owner of the land described in the deed of 1873, originally filed as joint ownership with Thomas Joseph Calloway, transferred in full to the surviving co-owner upon death of the joint holder." He paused. "It's done." She held the letter and read it herself and then read it again, and he watched the same expression cross her face that he had seen in the town hall, that profound and private relief, the world aligning with what was right. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She looked up at him, and her eyes were brilliant, and then she crossed the room and walked straight into his arms, and he held her there in the quiet hotel lobby with the morning sun coming through the front window, and she pressed her face against the front of his shirt and said nothing for a long moment. He held her and breathed, and thought that this was the best moment he had had in many years, and possibly ever. Eventually she pulled back and looked at him, composed again but with the warm openness that she showed him now and almost no one else. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I have been thinking about what comes next. The land is mine. The house is being built. I have some money, not much, and a great deal of work ahead of me, and I am not afraid of any of it." She paused. "But I have also been thinking that I have been alone for a long time. Not lonely exactly, but alone. And this past month it has been the first time in a very long time that I have not been alone, and I find that I don't want to go back to it." He was very still. "Beatrice, I am not asking you for anything," she said quickly. "I am not presuming, I am just telling you where I am." "I know where you are," he said, "because I am in the same place." He took her hand, which was something he had not done before, with the deliberate, careful quality he brought to everything that mattered. "I want you to hear me clearly, because I am going to say this once and mean it for a long time after. I have been alone a long time too, not because I had to be, because nothing I found was worth changing it for. And then you walked into my office with a legitimate document and the expression of someone who had been waiting too long for someone to simply tell them the truth, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked. "I thought, this is someone worth knowing for the rest of my life." She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and something in her face went entirely still and entirely open at the same time. "Warren Hudson," she said softly. "Beatrice Underwood," he said. And the sun came through the hotel window and she was laughing again, and he was laughing with her, and Margaret Prine appeared in the kitchen doorway and observed them both with the serene satisfaction of someone who has been expecting this development for at least 3 weeks and is pleased to have been correct. Summer came to the Kansas plain and brought with it heat and thunderstorms, and the kind of long golden evenings that made the grasslands look like something from the book of Genesis. The house on the Callaway land, which Beatrice had already begun thinking of simply as her land, began taking shape under Elias Drummond's capable direction. The frame went up in June, solid good lumber hauled from Wichita, and Beatrice was out there nearly every day watching and learning, and occasionally holding things or handing things to the builder, with the focused interest of someone who intends to understand every inch of the structure she will live in. Warren came on the weekends and brought lunch and his own capable hands, because while he was a surveyor and not a carpenter, he was a practical man who had built enough outdoor structures in the course of his work to be useful. On a Saturday in late June, they were working on the kitchen side of the house together, and Beatrice was measuring a window frame with the careful attention she brought to everything, and Warren was watching her and thinking the thought he had been thinking for 2 months now, that this woman moving around this land in the summer light was something he wanted to see every day for the rest of his life. He said, "Beatrice, marry me." She turned around with the measuring tape in her hand. She looked at him. "Now." "Not this second, no, but yes, I mean it, marry me." She held his gaze for a long moment, and something moved through her expression that he recognized as the same careful honesty she applied to everything, weighing it, considering it not out of doubt but out of respect for the seriousness of the thing. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I was married before, and I was loyal to that marriage even when it was difficult because I believe in the keeping of promises. If I make this promise, I will keep it, through whatever comes. That is what I am." She paused. "So you should be sure." "I am sure," he said. "I have been sure since April." She stood there in the June sunlight with the measuring tape in her hand and the half-built house behind her, and then she set the tape down and walked to him and took his face in both her hands the way he had taken hers on the creek bank, and she said, "Yes, Warren Hudson, yes." Reverend Tobias Marsh married them on a Saturday in September of 1878, in the small church in Caldwell with the repaired front step, because Warren had fixed the step in July, because the Reverend had been so kind, and deserved a step that would not break someone's ankle. The church was full because most of Caldwell had come, because Margaret Prine had told everyone and Margaret Prine's invitations were not precisely optional, and because people who had followed the story of the land claim felt a proprietary warmth toward its outcome. Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had chosen at Cal Hutchins's dry goods store, a deep sage green that suited her enormously, and that several women in the congregation noted with quiet admiration. She had her hair down and dressed simply, with no hat, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers from along Bluff Creek that she had picked herself that morning. Warren, standing at the front of the church, watched her walk up the aisle toward him in the slant of September light through the church windows and felt, in a way that had nothing to do with words, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, looking at each other the way they had looked at each other from the beginning, directly and without reservation. And when Reverend Marsh said the words that completed it, and Warren took her face in both hands and kissed her, the congregation made the sound that congregations make in moments of universal approval, and Margaret Prine cried in the thoroughly satisfied way of someone who has contributed to a good outcome. They moved into the house on Beatrice's land in October, when the harvest was in and the first cold was beginning to sharpen the mornings. The house was exactly what she had planned, not large but solid, with good windows that caught the light, and a kitchen garden on the south side where she had planted garlic and winter herbs before the frost, and a sitting room with a fireplace where the autumn evenings became something warm and quiet, and entirely their own. Warren closed his office in town at the end of October, because the town was close enough that he could go in for client meetings and come home in the same day, and because, having spent 2 years living in rooms above his office, the idea of going home to something other than surveying equipment and cold coffee was a thing he had not previously understood the full value of. He understood it immediately, and completely on the first evening he sat in the firelight in his own sitting room with his wife across from him, reading, her hair loose around her shoulders and a cup of tea on the side table, the prairie wind outside and the warm smell of the wood smoke inside. And he thought, with the precise certainty of a man who has taken careful measurements, that this was right in every particular. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a good one, cold but manageable, and they worked the land together through it, learning it in its dormant season, planning the spring. Warren built a small outbuilding for the horse and the mule she had finally purchased outright. Beatrice laid out her plans for a kitchen garden that were ambitious enough to require Warren to quietly expand the fence line to accommodate them, which he did without comment and which she noticed, and thanked him for with a look that said everything about what they had become to each other. They had long evenings. They talked the way people talk when they have genuinely found the person they are meant to talk to, about everything and nothing, about the law and the land and Kansas history, about their families and their losses, about what they wanted and what they had given up wanting and what they had found instead. He made her laugh regularly. She made him think harder about things he had assumed were settled, which he found, to his surprise, that he loved rather than resisted. One evening in February near the fire, she said to him, "I want to tell you something." He looked up from the survey map he was working on. "Tell me." "I think I am pregnant." He was very still. Then he set down the map and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, not shock, not performance, but something that was very quiet and very profound, joy that was too serious to rush. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I've been fairly certain for 2 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I said it." He got up from his chair and crossed the room and sat beside her on the settle near the fire and took both her hands in his. "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am more than well. I am—" she paused. "I am happy. Warren, I am genuinely happy. I wanted you to know that." He brought her hands to his lips and held them there for a moment, and then he looked at her over them and said, "So am I genuinely." "So am I." She leaned her head against his shoulder. And outside, the February wind moved across the Kansas plain, and the fire in the hearth made the room amber and warm, and they sat together for a long time without needing to say anything more. Spring came back to the land along Bluff Creek, and Beatrice worked her kitchen garden with the energetic stubbornness of a woman who will not be slowed down by something as manageable as pregnancy. Though she was sensible about it, resting when she needed to and accepting Warren's careful, unobtrusive attentiveness without either dismissing it or making him feel that his concern was unnecessary. They had found in their months together a balance that suited them both, her independence and his steadiness fitting together the way good machinery fits, each part doing its own work, and the result being something larger than either part. The house became more itself through the spring. Warren built a proper porch on the south side, because Beatrice wanted somewhere to sit in the evenings and watch the land, and he built it with care, good and level, with a railing at the right height for leaning and wide enough for 2 chairs with room between them for the small table where the coffee cups lived in the mornings. They sat on that porch many evenings as the spring advanced, watching the light change over the grassland, the creek shining in the distance, the cottonwoods going from bare to green again, and Warren would watch Beatrice watching the land and think about all the circumstances that had brought them both to this specific porch in this specific light, and feel the complex gratitude of someone who knows precisely how close things came to being otherwise. Doyle Harker left the Caldwell area entirely in the early spring, taking his cattle operation south. Nobody was particularly sorry to see him go, and the news traveled through town with the quiet, satisfied quality of something that has been waiting to resolve itself. Gerald Stokes remained at the land office, but he had become notably more careful in his assessments of deed filings, which Warren observed with professional approval and no particular charity. The fraud complaint that Warren had ultimately filed against Harker was heard in Wichita in March, and while Harker escaped the more serious penalties through the legal maneuvering of Ernest Combs, he was censured, fined, and the ruling explicitly stated that his homestead filing had been made in misrepresentation of material fact. Warren considered this less than ideal justice but more than many people received, and he filed the ruling neatly in his professional records. Beatrice read the ruling when Warren brought it home. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the strongbox that now lived on the shelf in their bedroom, alongside Thomas Calloway's original deed, which had now been superseded by her own full registration, but which she kept because it was the beginning of the story that had led her here, and she had learned, somewhere along the way, to respect beginnings. Their son was born in October of 1879, in the house on the land along Bluff Creek, attended by Margaret Prine, who had appointed herself present at the birth with the same unstoppable authority she brought to everything, and who turned out to be, in this as in most things, entirely indispensable. He came into the world healthy and loud, which Margaret declared a good sign, and which Warren, sitting outside the bedroom door in a state of quiet, controlled terror, received as the best sound he had ever heard. Beatrice held the baby and looked at Warren when he came in, and the expression on her face was the most open he had ever seen it, beyond the careful dignity, beyond the studied composure, pure and radiant and complete. "He has your eyes," she said. Warren sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small face. The eyes, when they opened briefly, were the unfocused blue-gray of a new Kansas sky. "He might change." "He might," she agreed. "But right now they are yours." He reached out and touched the baby's cheek with one finger, with the extraordinary care of someone handling something of incomprehensible value. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names, of course, in the preceding months, but they had left the final decision to the moment which Beatrice had said felt more honest. She looked at the baby for a long moment. "Samuel," she said quietly, the name of the son she had lost. Warren looked at her and she met his eyes, and there was a whole conversation in it, the grief and the healing and the choice to move forward, the way that love can hold sorrow and joy at the same time without crushing either. "Samuel Hudson," he said. "Samuel Warren Hudson," she said. He did not trust himself to say anything for a moment, so he did not say anything. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead instead, which said what he needed it to say. Margaret Prine, who was in the corner doing something practical with towels and doing an excellent job of not appearing to have heard anything, said, "That is a fine name," in a voice that was slightly thicker than usual. "I'll go put the kettle on." Samuel Warren Hudson grew through his first year in the vigorous, opinionated way of a child, who has two parents who think carefully about everything, and are not surprised when he does the same. He had Beatrice's dark hair and what appeared to be Warren's persistence, showing up in his determination to walk months before anyone thought it was strictly advisable, pulling himself upright on every available surface with a focused intensity that made Warren, watching him, think, yes, that is exactly where he came from. The land along Bluff Creek became, in those years, exactly what Beatrice had imagined and somewhat more. She expanded the kitchen garden to a proper working garden, sold produce to the hotel and the dry goods store, and kept the finances of the land with the same clear-eyed precision she brought to everything else. Warren's surveying practice grew with the town, which was growing fast, as the railroad pushed further west and brought settlers who all needed their land properly measured and documented. He took on an apprentice in 1880, a young man of 20 named Eli Carpenter, who had the spatial intelligence for the work and the willingness to learn, and Warren taught him with the same patience and thoroughness that had characterized everything else he had done in his professional life. Beatrice, meeting Eli for the first time, said afterward to Warren, "He's good. He'll be better than you in 5 years if you teach him properly." Warren said, "I know, that's why I hired him." She looked at him with the warm, direct look. "I do love you," she said, which she said with the same straightforwardness she said everything, without ceremony but with complete sincerity, the way you hand someone something important. "I know that too," he said, and pulled her close in the kitchen in the afternoon light. "I love you equally." "Equally is not the same as the same," she said against his shoulder. "No," he agreed. "It's better." In the spring of 1881, when Samuel was walking and talking and had strong opinions about which of the horses he was allowed to approach, Beatrice told Warren she was expecting again. He took the news with the same quiet depth as the first time, though with somewhat less terror and somewhat more simple joy, sitting at the kitchen table in the morning and taking her hand and saying, "I am glad." "So am I," she said, "enormously. How are you feeling?" "Like I am growing a person," she said with practical humor. "Capable but busy." He laughed. He was always glad when she made him laugh, which was often. Their second child was a daughter, born in November of 1881, with her mother's dark hair and an expression of serene assessment that appeared in her face from her first moments and never entirely left. They named her Clara after the woman Beatrice had helped at the hotel that first week in Caldwell, who had gone on to resolve her situation with admirable efficiency, and was now married to a farmer in Sumner County, and sent a letter twice a year. Clara Hudson arrived in the world without the drama of her brother, and surveyed her new surroundings with what could only be described as professional interest, which delighted Warren so completely that Beatrice told him he was going to spoil her within the first hour, and he said, unrepentantly, that he planned to. The years that moved through Caldwell and along Bluff Creek in the early 1880s were not without difficulty. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary troubles of farming and business and raising children. There were times when money was tighter than comfortable, and times when the work was heavier than either of them had energy for. There was a flood in the spring of 1882 that took out part of the creek bank and 2 sections of fence, and required 3 hard weeks of work to repair, during which Beatrice organized the effort with the efficiency of a military commander, and Warren did the physical work and kept the frustration of it from becoming anger, which was his contribution to the balance. There was grief, too, because grief is part of any life lived fully. Margaret Prine died in the winter of 1883, at the age of 64, of a winter fever that came on fast and left no time. Beatrice held her hand at the end and cried with a thoroughness she had not cried for most things, because Margaret had been her first friend in Caldwell, and the kind of person who makes a place feel like it could be home. The hotel passed to Margaret's niece, a capable young woman from Missouri who kept the clean sheets and the direct opinions and was declared, by universal Caldwell agreement, a worthy successor. Warren and Beatrice attended the funeral together, and he held her hand through the service, and afterward they walked back along the main street of Caldwell in the winter cold, not talking, just together, and she leaned slightly against his arm, and he felt the weight of her there and was glad, in the way you are glad for something when you have understood clearly what its absence would mean. In the spring of 1883, on a morning of clean light and warm wind, Warren and Beatrice were both working near the creek, she weeding the near edge of the garden, and he doing a small survey adjustment on the property boundary for a letter to the county recorder. And Samuel, who was 3½ and currently unstoppable, was investigating the creek with the focused scientific interest of someone planning to understand every stone in it personally. Beatrice straightened and looked at Warren across the garden, and he looked up at the same moment, and they looked at each other across the rows of spring plants with the warm late morning light on everything. And she smiled, the full bright smile that she had given him first on that Monday afternoon when she sat in his office and told him the story of her land and her life. And that was still, 4½ years later, the thing that made the world feel most entirely right. He crossed the garden to her, moving between the rows, and she met him at the edge of it, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood together watching Samuel crouch over the creek with complete absorption. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering the question. "I am thinking," she said, "that I rode into Caldwell 5 years ago on a borrowed mule with $32 and a piece of paper that nobody was willing to read, and I was very tired and very angry and not particularly hopeful. And," he said, "and I am thinking that everything that happened after that was the direct result of one man deciding to actually look at what was in front of him." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Which is you. You did the fighting," he said. "We did the fighting," she said, which was what she had said on the day of the hearing and which she had always meant. He pressed a kiss to her temple, and she closed her eyes briefly, and the creek ran over its stones, and the cottonwoods moved in the morning wind, and Samuel found a particularly interesting rock and held it up to the light with a look of pure discovery. It was an ordinary morning, which was to say it was a very good morning, which was to say it was what they had made together from everything they had each carried to that first meeting, the grief and the injustice and the loneliness and the work and the will. Two people who had each understood the value of doing things properly and truthfully, and had, in meeting each other, found the place where that understanding could become a life. Warren kept working his survey practice and kept teaching Eli Carpenter, who was indeed becoming remarkable, and kept coming home in the evenings to the house on the land along Bluff Creek, and sitting on the south porch and watching the sky go from gold to rose to the deep clear blue that meant something was coming. The same sky he had been watching his whole adult life in this country, but different now, because she was beside him. Beatrice kept the land with disciplined love, expanding its productivity each year, and kept her quick mind on everything around her, and kept a kind of clear-eyed warmth toward the people of Caldwell who had started as strangers and become something closer than acquaintance, and kept, through all of it, the fundamental quality that had walked through Warren's door on that April Monday with a legitimate document and a legitimate claim: the knowledge of her own worth, and the refusal to let the world's laziness or self-interest convince her otherwise. They added to the south porch a bench, long enough for 2 adults and occasionally 2 children, and in the evenings when the work was done and the children were in bed or playing near the creek, they would sit together on that bench in the way of people who have no need to perform their happiness because it is simply, thoroughly, actually present, and they would watch the enormous Kansas sky do its evening work. And the cattle sounds from the south and the cricket sounds from the creek grass and the wind in the cottonwoods would make the night music of the grassland, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Beatrice Underwood had come to Caldwell in the spring of 1878 with a document in a leather satchel and the absolute, unwavering knowledge that the land it described was hers. She had been right, and the one man who had stopped to actually read the paper had turned out to be the beginning of the rest of her life, not because he had saved her, she had not needed saving, but because he had seen her clearly from the first moment and never once looked away. That she had told him once, in the quiet of their bedroom with the children asleep and the wind off the plain moving through the curtains, was the rarest thing. Not love, which happened often enough in the world, but being seen. Being accurately, completely seen and found in that seeing worth everything. He had said simply, "You are worth everything." And the Kansas night had been very quiet after that and very full.